Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode number 43 for Sunday the 18th of November 2018. This episode covers the 2015 movie Spotlight, starring Rachel McAdam, Mark Ruffalo, Michael Keaton and Liev Schreiber, amongst other people. My name is Martin Darlington, and with me, as ever, is Andrew Blischek. Hello, Andrew.
Hi, Martin. Let's start off with some updates first of all. Please note we've updated the planned episode page on the website and have added the following movies. 27th of January 2019, Gallipoli, the 1981 movie starring Mark Lee and Mel Gibson as young Australian soldiers caught up in the disastrous invasion of the Dardanelles Peninsula during World War I.
On the 10th of February 2019, the next episode, a fortnight later, we'll be doing The King's Speech with Colin Firth playing King George VI and Geoffrey Rush as Lionel Logue, the Australian speech therapist who tries to cure his stammer. Both of them wonderfully supported by Helena Bonham Carter as Queen Elizabeth, more recently known as the Queen Mother.
Then on the 24th of February 2019, we're doing The Big Short, a 2015 movie detailing the circumstances that led to the global financial crash of 2008. It's got a stellar cast including Steve Carell, Christian Bale, Ryan Gosling and Brad Pitt. All of these dates are somewhat subject to change as we've got a couple of collaborative episodes in the pipeworks with some other podcast shows, so we may need to slot one of those into the dates that we've just mentioned, but all movies we've just discussed will be covered.
Yeah, we'd also like to draw your attention to another fellow podcast, the Assassinations podcast, hosted by Niall Cooper. Or he may be Neil Cooper. It's spelt Niall, but some people still pronounce it Neil. So I'm going to use Niall, and if I got it wrong, I do apologise. Niall's tagline is that since Julius Caesar was stabbed to death in the hope of reinstating the Roman Republic, which of course didn't happen, there have been men and women who would wield knife, gun or bomb with the aim of changing the world. And he looks at each incident and what effect it did have, and he's covered such diverse incidents as the killing of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which most historians credit with having sparked the First World War, the murder of Leon Trotsky, and then he drifts into conspiracy theories with things like the death of UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld and Princess Diana. It's thoroughly recommended. Niall's research is impeccable, it's very well delivered, and you can find his website at assassinationspodcast.com. That's assassinations plural with an S at the end, podcast, all one word, .com.
On with reviews. Well, unfortunately, once again, we don't have any new reviews this week, just like last time. So Andrew Martin have still got their sad faces on. Yeah.
But we did hear from Bob Gorzenio, didn't we?
We did.
And again, I'm hoping I got the pronunciation right. Bob wrote in and he suggested The Greatest Showman. He said he enjoyed the film but got the impression that very little is true in the movie. Now, both Andrew and I replied, my wife and daughter absolutely loved the film. I tried watching it, I got 40 minutes in and turned it off. I just found nothing to like about it.
Too trite?
I like Moulin Rouge. I really enjoyed Moulin Rouge, but this had no memorable songs, and I found myself, I really like Hugh Jackman as an actor, but I found myself wincing on his behalf at this sort of teenage bubblegum pop band dance routines they were making him do. And from what I've read of P.T. Barnum, he wasn't a likeable person, and Hugh Jackman inevitably makes him a likeable person. So, no, I didn't like it, and its history is very, very off the mark by all accounts.
Well, there is some truth in there, of course.
Oh yeah, they got his name right.
The woman that he had the affair with, I think that was true. Her name.
But you enjoyed the film, didn't you?
I enjoyed it. Yeah, I had to, suspend disbelief and put myself very much into Moulin Rouge mode. This is a bit of, flight of fantasy, but I did like it in the end. But as you say, viva the difference, Martin.
Yep. So it's unlikely, I think, we'll do that simply because I'm not sure I could sit through it, and it's a
bit too light and inaccurate, I think. So we'll just park that one, I think.
But Bob, thank you very much for the email, and if you do have any other suggestions, do please fire them in. And now on with the show, and we'll start with the story of the movie.
Okay. 2015 Spotlight was directed by Tom McCarthy, for which he was nominated for Best Director at the 2016 Oscars. He was, however, unsuccessful. Spotlight stars Michael Keaton, Mark Ruffalo, Rachel McAdam and Liev Schreiber as investigative reporters at the Boston Globe during the early 2000s, when they uncovered a huge cover-up by the Catholic Church into chronic child abuse by many of their priests in the Boston area. For the article, the team won the Pulitzer Prize, but more importantly, they triggered a worldwide investigation into similar abuses.
Which, of course, is still ongoing, as we'll get to later. The movie did win 2 Oscars, Best Picture and Best Original Screenplay, and was nominated for a host of other awards at the Oscars, the Golden Globes, the BAFTAs and such like. On Rotten Tomatoes, the critic score is 97% and the audience gave it 93%, so it's a very well received movie. According to thenumbers.com, the production budget was 20 million and the movie received around 98 million worldwide from the box office, which is, you know, a pretty good return. Yeah, I mean, it's a 5-time return. If I'd got that from my bank savings account, I'd be very happy.
True.
Now, one thing before we get into the synopsis and the reality check is a phrase you hear a lot from the Catholic Church in particular is pastoral care. And if you Google the phrase, you'll get a lot of hits quoting from the Bible, specifically 1 Peter chapter 5 verses 2 and 3. Interestingly, the pastoral care, if you look into the semantics of it, the word is from the Latin for shepherd. And you can see the same root in pasture.
And it's the responsibility of the priest towards his own flock.
Exactly.
The duty of care he has to demonstrate.
So in lieu of introduction music, although Howard Shore was nominated for Best Score for the, I don't think he won, but Howard Shore did the Lord of the Rings movies, so he's a very accomplished film composer. But no, in lieu of that, we're going to hear a gentleman I found on YouTube, and he's going to read out, this is the Bible's definition of pastoral care.
Shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain, but with eagerness, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples to the flock.
So that's pastoral care, not taking advantage of your flock, in fact the exact opposite. So let's get on with the analysis. Spotlight starts with some text on the screen saying, based on actual events. We learn that it's Boston, Massachusetts, 1976. There's a police station and an older cop tells a younger one that a woman at the station is hysterical. She's divorced with 4 kids and that her father Gagan was helping out. In an interview room, the priest is talking to a distraught woman while her 3 children colour in with crayons. The young cop is told that nobody can discuss the case with the papers and that the case isn't going to be processed. Next, we're told it's Boston, July 2001. The newsroom of the Boston Globe newspaper. An older reporter is retiring to be replaced by a new editor. Robbie Robinson, Michael Keaton, senior manager, I'm not sure his exact role.
I think he's the team leader of
that's right,
Spotlight.
Yeah. Michael Keaton's character gives a playful speech about the departure. Another reporter, Mike, played by Mark Ruffalo, carries a piece of cake downstairs to the Spotlight department, a small office with only 2 other staff. Sasha Pfeiffer, played by Rachel McAdams, and Matt Carroll, played by Brian Darcy James. They're working through their lunch on some story. They mention how sad it is to see their colleague Stuart go, and mention many others are also leaving. The new boss that's coming in on Monday might be cutting a lot of jobs, as he did in his last job, and they're worried he's going to reduce the tight Spotlight team of 4. Nobody's met him yet, but Robbie is due to have lunch with him.
Yeah, because Spotlight, they're as Robbie, the next scene, Robbie meets Marty Barron, played by Liev Schreiber, and he's the new incoming editor, and he's moved up from Florida, so he's not a Boston guy. He's not Boston. All the rest of them are Boston born and bred. And he said, I've been reading The Curse of the Bambino, which is a baseball book, I believe, about the Boston Red Sox.
About the Boston Red Sox and when they sold a Babe Ruth at the start of his career to the New York Yankees.
Whoops.
And they made a big mistake, and some wag determined that the Bambino, which is Babe Ruth, they said that they will never ever win a World Series because of this faux pas they did early in the century. And that held true. That was the curse of the Bambino, held for a long, long time. It was broken very recently, 2010, 2005.
I vaguely remember that.
And since they've won a couple more, in fact, they won this year's World Series again. So the curse is now broken, but it did hang around for a long time.
So I must admit, I find baseball, it's like cricket, but without the edge of your seat excitement. And yes, that's said with quite a lot of sarcasm. Quite like playing cricket. I'm not very good at watching it. Anyway,
so clearly the
Marty
new
Barron's,
editor.
he's reading it, and yeah, he's the new editor. And Robbie says, "Oh, we'll take you to a Red Sox game." And Marty says, and he's very understated, isn't he? Liev Schreiber plays it brilliantly. He'll pause, think, and then very quietly he says, "I don't really like baseball. I'm just trying to get a feel for the new city." And he asks about Spotlight, and Robbie explains that it's a 4-person team and they do investigative reporting, which sometimes can take a year to chase a story down, and they're given time and space, and they report directly to Ben Bradley Jr.
Now, we've seen that name before, haven't we?
Haven't we just? Yes, because Ben Bradley Jr., who was on this Boston Globe team, his dad was Ben Bradley, who was the Washington Post editor that we met in The Post, played by Tom Hanks.
And this is his son.
So you see, Ben Bradley Jr. and this movie, 2 degrees of separation to Kevin Bacon, who also appeared in an HBH show, Apollo 13, alongside Tom Hanks. Yes. So yeah, you can do that. In Hollywood, you can get to Kevin Bacon in 2 hops. You don't need 6. Anyway, I'm digressing. So the team have just finished a story on a negligent construction site, and Marty Barron says, "Oh, what are you working on now?" And Robbie said, "Well, we're rooting around looking for a new story." And this is where he says how long it can take them. Robbie also tells him that their investigation at the moment has been on the new editor because everyone's concerned about losing their job. So Marty says that's understandable. The internet's making classifieds obsolete and they're losing revenue and everyone's getting nervous. And Robbie asks him if this is why he asked about Spotlight. But Marty says, no, I've got another reason. So he asks him to come to a meeting the next day.
So the next day at 10:30, Robbie attends a meeting where Marty is being introduced to the senior staff. Marty, the new editor, asks the assembled staff if they've read their column about the Gagan case.
This is the priest that we saw in the opening scene, isn't it?
At the police station, yeah. They're only vaguely familiar with them, so he tells them about it. It's about a Catholic priest that molested many children in 6 different parishes over the last 30 years. The lawyer for the victims, one Mr. Garabedian, said that Cardinal Law, who's the head honcho in the Catholic Church in Boston, found out about it 15 years earlier, but did nothing. Cardinal Law denies this, but the lawyer, Garabedian, claims that he has documents that can prove it. Marty, the editor, says that people should write about the story since it's only been in their paper twice in small articles in the last 6 months. Robbie, Michael Keaton, points out that the documents are sealed, but Marty tells him that they can take the church to court for access. Ben Bradley confirms, "Are you suggesting that they sue the Catholic Church?" And Marty says, "Yes," although he says technically all they're doing is filing a motion to lift the seals on these documents. Ben Bradley points out that everyone will still consider that they're suing the church. Marty is worried because this is Catholic Boston after all.
Oh, Marty isn't worried. Yeah, and it's worth probably pointing out that the Marty Barron character is Jewish.
Yeah.
So they're like, okay, he's from out of town.
He's not married. Doesn't have
Christian,
kids.
yeah.
He doesn't follow baseball, and he's Jewish.
He's not like us at all.
Which is the most un-Boston characteristics.
So in Ben Bradley's office, Ben and Robbie update Mike on Marty's suggestions to sue for the sealed documents in the Gagan case. Now, Mike Resendez is a character who will, I think, pretty much lead the film. I absolutely loved Mark Ruffalo's performance. He felt not naive, but just fresh and driven and absolutely in pursuit of the truth, irrespective of, let the chips fall where they may sort of thing. Eileen, who wrote the article, gives them the lowdown on the people involved. The judge on the case is Catholic, so they're not hopeful that she'll rule in their favour, and you can see already the sway that the Catholic Church has with senior officials. Marty suggests Spotlight take the story since it's now an investigative report.
Robbie tells the Spotlight group about their new story. Not just the Gagan case, but that Cardinal Law knew about the allegations and covered it up to protect the corrupt Catholic Church and the Vatican's reputation. They decide to investigate Gagan, as well as Eric McLeish, the lawyer for the victims of molestation by another priest a decade earlier. Mike decides to meet with Mr. Garabedian, who's representing the current victims. He's told that Garabedian is a personality, but that doesn't faze Mike, because Mike says he likes personalities.
The next day, we see Mike kept waiting when he goes to Mr. Garabedian's office. He's ignored. Meanwhile, Sasha and Robbie visit Eric McLeish, played by Billy Crudup. He's a handsome, suave, slightly slick lawyer, isn't he?
Yep.
They ask if Eric's been following the Gagan case, and he says, oh, there's 80 plaintiffs, all with individual cases, so it's not a class action suit. But Eric points out the molestation cases are all crap, to paraphrase, because the statute of limitation is only 3 years, which is just incredible.
Ridiculous.
For child rape, they got a statute of limitation of 3 years. Or they did have.
They did have, yeah.
They don't have any more in Massachusetts, I believe. But most victims don't come forward until they're adults because of the shame and the guilt, and they come from tough neighbourhoods where they don't want other kids to know they've been molested. And because the diocese comes under charitable immunity, the statute caps their damages they can be sued for at $20,000, which absolutely astonishes Robbie. Eric says they should try the cases through the press like he did years earlier, but he adds that most of the victims are afraid to be publicly interviewed. He knows because he represented some of them. Eric tells them that his settling the cases resulted in nothing more than an acknowledgement of their victimhood by the bishop and a few $1,000s. He says Garabedian doesn't really have sealed documents, he's just bluffing to get a better deal. They think that would be risky, but he says, well, if you knew Mitch Garabedian, then you'd know he'd do that. And, he sort of implies if you'd met him, you'd understand.
Seems a bit odd.
Yeah.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground there, Martin. We've got a newspaper that's changing times. They've got a new editor. We've had a bunch of names of people that may or may not be real. We've got a growing investigation. We've got Father Gagan and another priest.
And Cardinal Law.
Cardinal Law and existing lawyers that have been sort of scratching around at this. There's a lot of room for error there. How did they go?
Well, this is a bit like the second half of Argo, but reversed. Because it's all true.
Yep. Pretty much everything that we just mentioned is spot on.
Yep.
The names, the dates, the places.
If not the actual words in the conversation, the results of those conversations and the messages contained therein.
It's a phenomenally accurate film from what we can tell.
It is. Yeah. So we then, going back to the movie, we now meet Mr. Garabedian, played by Staniel Tucci, when Mike sneaks into his office as the client leaves. Mike reminds him of their appointment, but Mr. Garabedian tries to get rid of him, saying, oh, the Phoenix is writing an article on him. Mike says, look, I'm following up on an article Eileen McNamara wrote about your suit, and he's told that there are 84 individual suits, it's not one large one. Mr. Garabedian says, I can't show you the documents because they're sealed. The church is trying to get him disbarred, and he doesn't want to be speaking to Mike or to be on the record in any way, even in Mike's handwritten notes. But Mike goes along with all of this. He's like, yep, no, that's fine. Garabedian tells him he's already talked to the Phoenix, but Mike says, yeah, but no one reads the Phoenix. That's why I didn't know you'd spoken to them. He said, the Globe still has power. If we cover the story, everyone will read it. In some ways, you could say we're as powerful as the Catholic Church. Mike says, look, can I interview some of the victims? Garabedian thinks about it and says, look, I need a bit of time. Call me tomorrow. Now, we've got a couple of clips here. One is Mark Ruffalo talking about why he took the movie on. And in the interview, you won't hear this bit, but he was asked by the interviewer, she'd heard that he got the script on Friday and said, I'm in on Saturday. And he went, yep, pretty much. So we'll hear him explain why he wanted to play the movie. Sat next to him on the couch is the real Mike Resendiz, the real reporter who was part of that team and still very much around, very active. And we'll hear him talking about, and this is just a bit of an aside really, on when actors portray people with those characters, cooperation, when they're still alive and see themselves. I mean, remember with Rush, what Nicky Lauda saying when he saw, I can't remember his name, the young German chap who played him in Rush.
Yeah.
And he said, Oliver something, he said, that was me. I could see me on the screen. It was amazing. So this is Mark Ruffalo and then Mike Resendiz.
And it just felt so honest, and it left out the salacious part of the story and went directly to the investigation. So you're allowed to enter this world and look at this very hard story in a dispassionate way. So by the end of it, you get a real moral certitude about where you end up.
What was it like having him shadow you, Mike?
Well, turn the tables there on you, Mike.
It was turning the tables, and at first it was a bit disconcerting because Mark came right into my living room. I'd never met him before. And without anything in the way of introduction, he sits down, he opens a notebook, he pulls out a pen, and he turns on his iPhone and he starts asking me questions. And they were kind of personal questions, and I thought, wow, this is pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But then I thought about how many times I'd done that to other people, and I started to relax into it, and ultimately we had a great conversation.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to the movie. We're at the Globe. Marty meets with other Globe staff, and they tell him about challenging the protective order in the Gagan case. It turns out that the subscriber base of the Globe is clearly majority Catholic, but they okay the lawsuit. Down in the Spotlight office, a woman brings clippings on past reports regarding the case. Sasha Amy McAdams mentions an organisation for survivors of priest molestation called SNAP, Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. It's run by one Phil Saviano. Matt finds a clip from their religious column that mentions another priest molesting kids in Ohio, and then being moved to Boston, where he did the same thing. It wasn't Cardinal Law who swept it under the rug, it was another cardinal. They now see a pattern where these men are found molesting kids. They quickly move to another parish, and the molestation continues. The article mentions a Jim Sullivan, who's a friend of Robbie's, and it was Jim Sullivan that defended the priest in this instance. Robbie then meets with Jim Sullivan, played by James Sheridan, and with Jim Sullivan's wife for dinner. Robbie asks them about the priest that Jim represented and whether the cardinals covered it up. Jim says he can't talk about the case, even off the record.
Yeah, we then see Sasha attending church with a very Catholic grandmother, a little bit torn now that she's learning more about the cardinal covering up and the number of priests that seem to be molesting young boys and girls. She looks at the young children singing in the choir. Meanwhile, back at the Globe, Mike Resendiz continues trying to reach out to Garabedian, the lawyer. Marty Barron, the new senior editor, meets with Cardinal Law, who says, "Oh, I'm very much looking forward to working with the Globe." But then again, in this very firm but calm, understated way, Marty says, "I always find that as a newspaper we're best to perform without outside influence from the church or anywhere else." And the Cardinal then mentions, "Oh, another paper lost a lot of subscribers when the church disagreed with their stance on a topic." So there's obviously a threat in there.
Yeah.
Then a secretary comes in and gives Marty a gift, bearing in mind that Marty Barron is a Jewish character, and the gift is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Meanwhile, we see Robbie and Mike joining Ben Bradley at a baseball game, and there's another reporter there, and they mention a potential meeting with Saviano. But Ben Bradley and this other reporter know him, and they say, "Oh, he's a nut job." Basically, they sort of write him off.
He's
not a reliable source. He sends hundreds of letters to us, and he's just attention seeking.
This is the second or third time already that someone's tried to denigrate
Phil Saviano.
Phil Saviano and Garabedian too. They're setting them up as not reliable witnesses at all.
So the reality on that, the Sullivan character, friend of Robbie's.
Well, he doesn't exist. He is apparently an amalgam of a half dozen lawyers that the Spotlight team consulted on this sort of matter.
Yeah.
It makes it a bit easier to tell the story, and I think I call that a minor transgression for storytelling purposes.
Sure. Phil Saviano is a very interesting character. He was molested by a priest called Father Holly in his youth. He grew up, never told anybody about it. Now, he grew up a gay man, although he, as he says, that's irrelevant to what happened to him as a child. He did contract HIV.
Wow.
And it was only when he believed in the, I think, late 90s, he believed that he was, or the mid-90s it might have been, he was dying of AIDS because he got ill, he became ill. And he thought, with only weeks left to live, I've got nothing to lose. And he came out and told about these priests and what had happened to him. And I think that's what led them to Father Gagan, who'd somehow been involved as well. Now, Phil Saviano's still alive, so he didn't die of AIDS. He was ill, but he managed to recover. And he did have this network, but really commendable character, very strong character. But as he says, it was only the only thing that persuaded him it was okay to come forward. And at the time, he thought, well, it must have happened to someone else. But I'm still going to be alone. And actually, very quickly, he realised he was one of hundreds, if not thousands. Anyway, back to the movie.
We see the Spotlight team meeting with this Phil Saviano, the guy who runs Snap. He tells them that he was 11, he was preyed upon by a priest. He asks if any of them are Catholic, and it turns out they were all raised Catholic, but none of them are very religious now. Saviano tells them about his experience, and we've got a clip from the movie on that.
Yeah, this is slightly edited for content, so we don't need to put an explicit caveat on it, but if you have very small children, it'll be fine. If you have children who are listening, and I suspect there probably aren't many, but maybe early to mid-teens, you might want to say, I tell you what, go out and play football, and you can catch up on the rest of this later.
Well, let me tell you, when you're a poor kid from a poor family, religion counts for a lot. And when a priest pays attention to you, it's a big deal. He asks you to collect the hymnals or take out the trash, you feel special. It's like God asking for help. So maybe it's a little weird when he tells you a dirty joke, but now you got a secret together, so you go along. Then he shows you a porno mag, and you go along, and you go along, and you go along, until one day he asks you to jerk him off, and so you go along with that too, because you feel trapped, because he has groomed you. How do you say no to God, right? See, it is important to understand that this is not just physical abuse, it's spiritual abuse too. And when a priest does this to you, he robs you of your faith. So you reach for the bottle, or the needle, or if those don't work, you jump off a bridge. That's why we call ourselves survivors.
So that was Phil Saviano describing his experience, and he's a very compelling character. He's very well played. He comes across as very sincere and very earnest, but not in a kind of...
Not a way.
No, not at all. He tells them about a book written on a case in Louisiana and suggests talking to Richard Sipe, a former priest who worked at a treatment centre where priests are sent when they get caught molesting minors. He tells them he sent all this information to the Globe about 5 years before, but they never ran the story. And he was shocked because the story was big. Not just Boston, but the whole country, even up to the Vatican. He knows of at least 13 Catholic priests in Boston alone who have molested children.
The next day, Mike returns to meet with Garabedian, who tells Mike that he spoke with his clients and they don't want to be mentioned in the press. Mike explains this isn't for a profile piece, but for a spotlight story, which is much, much bigger and will get on the front page. This catches Garabedian's attention. He tells him to come back later that week. We see Robbie and Sasha meet with Saviano and wonder about his credibility. He points out that he's being smeared for speaking out against the Catholic Church and complains that they never took him seriously before. They mention that they have a new editor now who's taking the story seriously, and that Robbie himself is now involved and he wasn't before. Saviano seems convinced and decides to connect them with some of his survivors in his group.
Yeah, we see Sasha meet with a heavy-set, effeminate man named Joe at a cafe. He's very sweet, but he's very nervous. And meanwhile, Mike is meeting with one of Garabedian's clients at his office. Now, this guy's completely different. His name's Patrick. He's a handsome, masculine father, working-class lad. You know, he explains his dad killed himself, his mum was schizophrenic. He says he doesn't want his name published. The two interviews are intercut simultaneously. So we see Joe saying to Sasha that he was sent to a group for kids from troubled families by a nun, and this group was led by the priest who raped him. Now, I've been listening to the audiobook on which the movie was based, or the book the movie was based, and this guy comes up, Shanley, I think his name was, and they called him a street priest. He was a bit of a hippie, he wore jeans. Yeah, he was sort of saying no. He was challenged a lot of the church's conservative views, but at the same time he was invading these kids, bringing them in and raping them. Yeah, boys and girls. He wasn't gender specific. But Patrick, his story, he was taken in by a priest after he lost his father, and the priest, this was Gagan, would take him to go and get ice cream, which he found great, but on the drive home he'd start touching Patrick through his pants, which scared him, but he couldn't do anything because it was the priest. No one would believe him. And one thing that comes out time and again in the testimony that you read about these things is the priests use the fear of God and sin as a way of keeping the child quiet. They're not even honest enough to say, look, no one's going to believe you if you say anything. They try and sort of say, no, you've led me astray.
Yeah.
And I can help, but only if you do exactly what I say and don't tell anyone.
And already we've got these two victims being interviewed. One of them says his father killed himself and the mother was schizophrenic, and so he's clearly a vulnerable young man, boy. And the other was recommended by a nun to the priest from a group of people that are from broken homes.
Yeah.
So the priests are obviously playing on vulnerable, lower economic individuals that they can prey on.
The situation with Joe, the guy being interviewed by Sasha, he said very young he realised he was gay. He was a gay man, and the priest realised that he was and showed him a mobile over a baby's crib, and it had words on it like homosexual, transsexual, bisexual. Being attracted to men and forced into sex at an early age, though, really affected Joe. His mother found out about it years later, complained about the incident to the cardinal, who responded by moving the priest to another parish, a pattern that we've started to see. Sasha asked if his mother ever hired a lawyer, but he said he only went to a lawyer for the first time a few years ago and was told all he could get was a small settlement. Sasha asked if he could remember the lawyer's name, and he said, no, I don't. He was very handsome. And she says, it wasn't Eric McLeish, was it? The guy that they met, the team had met earlier, and went, yes, that's him. Meanwhile, back at the office with Mike, he's interviewing Patrick, and after the interview, finishing it off, Patrick says, do you know what? Use my name. Use my name if you do. Just get these kids, get these guys who are hurting kids, and just expose them.
Do we want to do a reality check on that, a very brief one?
Yeah, well, again,
it's all pretty much true.
All true. Yeah, and the Patrick character, it's not clear why his father committed suicide, but in the audiobook, there's one of the accounts where a kid, his older sister was like a second mother with him, and him and his girlfriend, when he was in his late teens, went to her house to have dinner with her and her husband, his brother-in-law, who was something legal. I don't think he was a lawyer himself, but or a police officer, but he was something like a DA's office he worked at or something. And they're talking, and his older sister said, oh, do you remember Father so-and-so from the youth club when we were kids? He's been accused of child molestation. And it came out. The lad started to cry and told the story. When they went home and told his parents, his mother started yelling at him, how could you say this about, a priest? And his father went, stop, be quiet. He said, I'm really impressed, son, because same thing happened to me. Same priest.
Oh, Jesus.
He was either a novice or a very, very young priest when he molested the lad's father. 20 years later, he's molesting his son. So he got 2 generations. So I don't think, and that father didn't kill himself, and that they came forward and they were part of the group that had these people outed, and some of them thankfully went to prison. One of them for 275 years. Americans don't mess around with prison sentences, do they? Entirely rightly in this case. Anyway, sorry, we digress.
Back to the movie.
Yeah.
We're with the Spotlight team in the Boston Globe, where everyone's comparing notes. Sasha realises that the lawyer McLeish has settled cases with a bunch of priests. They now have a list of 4 priests in the city who have molested children. Robbie has to persuade Ben Bradley, their editor, to let them carry on digging. He says that Saviano might be legit, the guy from Snap, and they've got 4 priests already in their sights. Yeah,
Ben Bradley's strangely reluctant, considering the genes he's carrying from his dad,
Yeah, and what a big story this is. You can sniff it, the new editor, Marty, he's got a nose for a story, and he's following it.
Yeah.
Ben Bradley does want to hold back a little bit too much, I think.
Meanwhile, Mike Resender's doing more of his frenetic digging, has discovered, got in contact with Richard Sipe, the former priest, on the phone. This is the guy who ran, he's a psychologist.
He wrote a book on Louisiana exposure.
He's told that this is a psychiatric phenomenon. It's not just a few bad apples. They're not aberrations. Mike explains to Robbie what he was told. They target kids from low-income families with absentee fathers who are in need of attention and help. They don't target boys because they're gay, but because their actual sexuality has no basis on molesting kids. It's just a form of power control. Sipe has learned of dozens of molesting priests over the years, but when he went public, the church smeared him. Mike and Robbie make their way to the basement, where Matt has pulled the annual directories listing all the priests in Boston. The directories show where any priest is in a given year. In one directory, Gagan is listed as being on sick leave. They checked the 1991 directory for the year, and another priest was accused another priest was accused of molestation. His name is listed as being on sick leave, and they start to realise This is like a cover designation by the church when someone's been moved after being caught molesting kids. They look through the directories and they'll see things like emergency response, sick leave, or absent listed for all the molesting priests they know about.
Which is about 4 at this time.
Yeah.
We then see Sasha and Robbie meet again with the good-looking lawyer Eric McLeish, but he still won't talk about the cases he's settled against the priest that molested Joe, the gay victim that Sasha met with earlier. They mention other cases, and Sasha asks why there aren't any records. Eric tells them he dealt directly with the church and that it was a private mediation. Back in the office, Sasha realises there's no paper trail because the victim had to sign a confidentiality agreement to get the settlement, modest as it was. Everything was done under the table, and the lawyer gets his fee from the church, who then maintains their clean image by washing the crime clean. Because Eric was confirmed to have defended the priest that molested the victims, they were now connected to, through Saviano, it gives him credibility. They're now looking at 7 or 8 priests they can discuss in their story.
Meanwhile, Marty and Robbie attend a gala run by the Catholic Church. Robbie was invited by a friend from the high school he went to, which is across the street from the Globe, and a very Catholic school. They're surrounded by powerful people in the Catholic Church, and meet 2 of them, Jack Dunn and Peter Conley. Robbie tells Marty that when they were investigating one of the priests a decade earlier, Cardinal Law literally called down the wrath of God on them, and one of the editors broke his leg skiing a few days later, and they have a little bit of a cynical chuckle about it. On the same night, Mike meets with Garabedian, the lawyer, for dinner, and is told that one of his clients filed a criminal complaint, but the church stepped in to protect Gagan using friends like Eric McLeish, the lawyer. Garabedian mentions it took an outsider at the Globe, Marty, the new Jewish editor, to break a story. And he also points out that he's not from Boston. And he says, if it takes a village to raise a child, it also takes an entire village to abuse one. In other words, you're all complicit because you're keeping quiet.
Jim Sullivan, Robbie's lawyer friend who defended priests in the past, greets Robbie at a bar.
Yeah, sorry, this is back at the gala dinner thing, isn't it?
Robbie mentions how Eric McLeish admitted to settling cases with the archdiocese out of court, quietly, with cash and a handshake. Robbie asks how many priests Jim Sullivan has represented, but Jim says he can't answer that because it's unethical. Robbie tells Jim that he should want to be on the right side of this. Yeah,
and we'll come back to Jack Dunn in a bit. That's a name that we'll revisit. Back at the Globe the next day, Sasha realises there are several of the same terms that the directories use when a priest is inexplicably removed from his parish. They then get on the phone to Richard Sipe, and they put the call in, and Mike puts him on speakerphone. Sipe tells him that through his research and his experience, only about 50% of Catholic clergy practice celibacy, which I think was introduced. It wasn't right at the beginning. It wasn't. It was a later pope introduced it to
celibacy.
Yeah, amongst the priesthood, so they wouldn't be distracted or have a conflict of interest between their flock and their family.
Yeah.
But he said only 50% practice celibacy. So immediately this creates a culture of secrecy, covering up sex between consensual adults. Then naturally extends over to covering up for paedophiles. And we've got a clip of that conversation they have over the phone with him, and it's quite dramatic.
So you believe the church is aware of the extent of this crisis?
Oh, absolutely. After the first major scandal in Louisiana, Tom Doyle, the secretary canonist for the papal nuncio, co-authored a report warning pedophile priests were a billion-dollar liability. That was in 1985.
1985?
That's right.
Who saw that report? Anyone from the Catholic hierarchy?
Sure. Doyle tried to introduce the report at the National Conference of Catholic Bishops. In fact, Cardinal Law initially helped to fund the report, but then he backed out and they shelved it.
Richard, Robbie here. We think we have 13 priests in Boston that fit this pattern, which would be a very, very big story. Does that sound right to you in terms of scale?
No, not really, Robbie. Sounds low to me. My estimates suggest 6% act out sexually with minors.
6% of what?
6% of all priests.
How many priests do we have in Boston?
About 1,500. 1% is 15. 6% is 90.
Wait. 90 priests?
Is that possible?
From a metric standpoint, yes. That would certainly be in line with my findings.
So we have the call with Richard Sipe, and then we see Robbie and Mike briefing Ben Bradley, and he's incredulous. He says, well, hang on, he said, if there were 90 priests doing this, people would know. Mike says, maybe they do, they just won't say anything. He's like, don't be taught ridiculous. And Mike makes a little comment, doesn't he? He said, well, not every German supported the Nazis, or something along those lines of basically people who are just keeping stum and going along.
Keeping their head down.
Yeah, absolutely. And he sort of gets a warning from Ben. Robbie suggests they use the directories to back-check, look up any priest list as being on sick leave or absent on leave or unassigned. Those same priests are moved from parish to parish every few years. So the reporters all begin working on compiling a list of names with these designations. So they're aware now, they're not looking at 13, they're looking at somewhere around 90.
The entire team, we see them working tirelessly on scanning these directories. At home, Matt realises that one of the priests' treatment centres, where they get sent presumably to get rehabilitated after they've committed these offences, is a house just around the corner from where he lives. He goes outside, crosses the road and stares at the house, flabbergasted. He puts a sign on his refrigerator telling his kids to stay away from that house and the men who live there. At the office, they finally compiled all their data into a single spreadsheet, and they have a list of 87 priests that the directory seems to suggest are being moved around and for molesting kids, right in line with the 6% of priests that Sipe suggested. Robbie calls Jim Sullivan and asks him, could there be as many as 90 priests that have been caught molesting kids in Boston? Jim tells him this has to stop, clearly not wanting to collaborate. We see Matt enter Robbie's office and tell him that he's discovered some of the molesters are living near his home, and he asks him whether he can tell the neighbours about their findings. Robbie's a bit torn, and he says you'll be able to tell them very soon, so he just manages to buy a little bit more time.
Yeah. We then see Robbie meet with Eric McLeish again, Robbie and Sasha, and he says, I've got a list of 87 priests that are potential child molesters. You need to give me the names of the priests that you settle cases for and their victims in order to verify their crimes, since the directories are obviously circumstantial. And we've got a rather marvellous little clip here of Robbie, threatening lawyer McLeish.
How many priests did you settle?
Robbie, you know, I can't tell you that.
You're going to give me the names and the names of their victims.
Are you threatening me?
We've got two stories here. We've got a story about degenerate clergy, and we've got a story about a bunch of lawyers turning child abuse into a cottage industry. Now, which story do you want us to write? Because we're writing one of them.
So Eric does agree to help, but he does point out he actually told the Globe about this years ago, including a list of priests, which would have been against his the confidentiality rules for lawyers, but the Globe buried the story. So Eric McLeish is not a total slimeball,
No.
which we should point out in the interests of truth, and also because he is a lawyer and might be alive still and come after us. So yeah, obviously the Globe previous incarnations have been as guilty as everybody else, as basically just keeping stum.
Yeah.
Back at the Globe, Sasha gets new clips and finds something very interesting. A clip that confirms, the clips are the little newspaper cuttings.
clippings, yeah.
It confirms that McLeish did give them a heads up years earlier.
So kudos to him.
Yeah.
And next we see Mike get a visit at home by Ben Bradley, the editor, who's curious about how they're getting on. Mike asks him who was it that received Phil Saviano's tip-offs 5 years earlier, and Bradley starts to get a bit defensive. At the Globe, presumably the next day, Robbie reveals that McLeish has shared a list of 46 priests that he represented, along with some of the victims' names. This is what Sasha found. Some of the victims of the 8 that they were told about by Saviano have agreed to go on record. Marty's concerned about Cardinal Law, referencing Robbie's story about how he called down the wrath of God after their past reporting. He wonders why he had such an extreme reaction when they reported on a single priest in the 1990s, given that the priest was elsewhere in Massachusetts at the time. Robbie suggests Cardinal Law had to know that there were others and that it was such a big story, even bigger than 50 priests. They suspected the church manipulated the system so the priests wouldn't face charges, that reporting on molestations wouldn't get a public reaction if they all seemed like isolated incidents. But showing that the cover-up came from the top will. Ben pulls Mike and Robbie into his office. He's worried that Cardinal Law is going to bully them if they run a story, which could tank their own, bring the whole paper down. They have to take Law down in a way that he won't be able to recover and he won't be able to smear them in reaction. That night, Sasha is leaving and shares with Robbie the newspaper clip that she found confirming McLeish's story. Robbie looks it over, but he has no response. He's a bit stunned.
Yeah, he looks a bit gobsmacked, doesn't he? The next scene we see, the entire group are going around interviewing witnesses, victims, witnesses, and even policemen who were involved in the investigation, and how the church covered it up with bribes or intimidation. And we even see them, well, the version of the film you saw had them interviewing the cop that we see right at the very beginning scene, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think you might have seen a director's cut, or I might have done, because the one I watched on Netflix didn't have that.
I see. Well,
but the movie's still the same movie. Sasha knocks on one door and meets a very meek and mild elderly chap who we discover is Father Paquin, one of the priests against whom the allegations have been made. And again, we've got a brief clip.
I'm looking for Ronald Paquin.
Yes?
Your Father Paquin?
Yes, that's right.
I'm Sasha Pfeiffer from the Boston Globe.
Okay.
Could I ask you a few questions?
Go ahead, dear.
We spoke to several men who knew you when they were boys at St. John the Baptist in Haverhill. They told us you molested them. Is that true?
Sure, I fooled around, but I never felt gratified myself.
Right. But you admit to molesting boys at St. John the Baptist?
Yes, but as I said, I never got any pleasure from it. That's important to understand.
Right. But can you tell me where and how you fooled around with these boys?
I want to be clear. I never raped anyone. There's a difference. I should know.
How would you know?
I was raped.
So Sasha gets Father Paquin to open up. I mean, it's such a creepy clip. But then Father Paquin's sister arrives at the door, asks Sasha who she is, and very angrily tells her, "Get off my porch." Meanwhile, back at the office.
Matt asks Robbie if he knows of a Father Talbot at BC High. He remembers him from when he went there. He's given a printout about him. Mike is in court. Then Mike is in court watching the case that the Globe is filing against the church to unseal some legal documents. The Catholic judge seems antagonistic to the Globe. The church's lawyer accused them of just wanting to sell papers, and Mr. Garabedian just wants to help his cases. Outside, Garabedian tells Mike that a priest discovered Gagan was molesting boys way back in 1962, but when he told the bishop, he was threatened into silence. Then, 30 years later, when he read about Gagan molesting hundreds of boys, he felt guilty and called Garabedian. Garabedian asked the priest to come in and sit down for a deposition on having given the church a heads up. But when he showed up, he was with the same lawyer attacking the Globe in court that day. Now the priest states that he has got suddenly a foggy memory and withdraws his claim that he told to his superiors. A year earlier, Garabedian found an article from a local paper revealing the priest finally went to the press to tell them about being silenced by officials in the 1960s. Now that he's got him on record, he has a good reason to talk to him again. But when he filed a motion to depose, the church's lawyer filed a motion opposing his motion. However, this allowed Garabedian to make an argument why he should be allowed to depose the priest, and he's able to present the documents that had been sealed earlier. These 14 documents prove everything about the church, the bishops, cardinal law, and now it's all in the public domain, in Garabedian's case. But if Mike goes to a courtroom and tries to retrieve them, he'll find they're missing because the church had them removed. Garabedian tells Mike to check the docket. Mike does, and sure enough, the exhibit folders are empty. Mike calls Robbie and tells him about the documents. He says that if the Globe's lawyer files a motion for the lawsuit against the church, the judge will order Garabedian to refile the documents, and they have a way finally to get their hands on these sensitive documents.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a bit convoluted.
It's a bit of legalese, but what's basically Garabedian's laid a trap which the church's lawyers walk straight into, smiling and stupid. And yeah, he's tried to have this, we'd call it a subpoena for this priest to be forced to come and give evidence. And he says because he's got him coming out in the 60s in this small local newspaper article, he thinks he can get him. But that's not actually what he was trying to achieve. What he knew the church would do is oppose that motion. He can then bring in collaborator in evidence, I guess, and this is why he can oppose the opposition to his original motion, and this is where these documents can be forced to put the documents back in. And this seems to be a pattern that clever lawyers have managed to use, and prosecutors across the states and I assume other countries.
So it would appear that all that legalese and the convoluted plot, that's pretty accurate according to the book.
It is. Now, one thing we do have to say, this was the another minor inaccuracy. The interview with Father Paquin was actually carried out by another Globe reporter, but Sasha Pfeiffer was the reporter who got the byline because she wrote up the interview. So it was part of the same investigation, but just for, I guess, not having another actor you've got to pay, they've used Sasha to have the interview.
And the fact that we're mentioning that minor discrepancy is a testimony how much everything else is correct.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the glib way that Father Paquin admitted, and then saying, but I got no gratification from it, as if that makes it all right. And this is not that unusual, that priests, either because they thought, well, I'm untouchable, I'm a priest, or, well, it was a very long time ago, no one could possibly object to me molesting their child, because it was 20 years ago, and we'll hear the Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro comment on the effect that time has on people's morals a bit later on. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't that unusual. It's absolutely incredible. Anyway, the next morning, yeah, they kind of get thrown off kilter, don't they?
Yeah, something's...
It's September the 11th, 2001, and everyone in the Globe newsroom, of course...
And across the world.
Yeah, and like the rest of us, are glued to a television watching the attacks on New York City and Washington. Later, Cardinal Law is on TV giving a speech about praying for the nation. Ben orders the Spotlight team to stop their story so they can focus on 9/11. It's the only story that could have derailed them from their larger investigation. Mike Resendez is sent away to Florida to investigate the flight school that trained the pilot of the first plane that crashed into the World Trade Center. He calls Garabedian and begs him not to refile the documents till he returns, because once he does, they'll be on public record and any other newspaper could find them and break the story without all the extra information they've uncovered. And I don't think this is so much about getting the credit. I think this is like, if they only publish limited bits, they can be shut down and then it's gone away. Sasha meets with Phil Saviano to tell him they've been taken off the story because the country needs the church at the time. Saviano says, yeah, I thought I needed the church. And a lot of people are reliving painful experiences in an effort to expose these crimes. He threatens to take the story to the Herald, but Sasha calms him down by saying, we are not abandoning the story. She's met with too many survivors and their families not to tell the story, but they need to tell it right and they need a few more weeks. And it sort of calms him down, but he still fires a couple of shots at her and walks out.
Next in the movie, it's Florida, and Mike is getting a call from Robbie, who tells him that Garabedian has now refiled the documents. He's then told he's been put back on the story because of this development. Mike flies back to Boston that afternoon. Robbie meets an old school friend at a cafe and asks him about Father Talbot. His friend Kevin asks, how did you find out?
Yeah, that's a really powerful scene, isn't it? Because his friend's a bit jokey, joshy, Irish Catholic Boston lad, and they're talking about golf and this, that, and the other. And then he mentions Father Talbot, and the guy's face goes a bit taut.
Yeah.
And he says, "Did you ever hear about him doing anything?" It's like, how did you find out? And I don't think Robbie knew.
No, he had to confirm he was fishing.
Yeah.
We see Mike go to the courthouse and he tries to get the documents that have now been refiled. The clerk is unhelpful and asks Mike if he knows what he's trying to retrieve. He's then told because of their sensitive nature he can't just hand them over, and Robbie will have to meet with a judge and get a judge's permission from upstairs judge's chambers. We see Robbie and Sasha visit the high school he went to, and they talk to the principal about the 7 victims that have come forth about being molested by Father Talbot. It is clear to Robbie that the brothers in charge must have known about the crimes when he was a student there because of how tightly everything was run. Jack Dunn and Peter Connolly, who Robbie had already met at a Catholic gala, are there defending the school. But the school's president says that if he was on board at the time, he would have done something. He admits they must have known since they sent Father Talbot out of town after he was caught. Robbie is told by Jack that the president's statement is off the record.
Yeah, it's almost like they all stare at him, the other guys from the Fellows College, with kind of, what on earth are you saying? A bit horrified.
Confirming it, yeah. Outside, Robbie points out to Jack that both of them are athletes while Father Talbot was a coach at the school. They escaped molestation, it turns out, by pure luck. They did the different sports that Father Talbot wasn't the coach for. Robbie notes that the Boston Globe is directly across the street from where these crimes took place. He rushes upstairs at the...
This is
Robbie.
Back with Mike Resendez at the court. Mike goes dashing upstairs. He sort of cuts from one scene to the other. He finds a judge, gets the necessary permission. He gets back down, gets the documents, goes to leave, and he's told, you can't take him out of the building. He said, well, I'm going to the copy room. He said, no, it's closed. So he says to the clerk, can I use your copier? And the guy's sort of not being very helpful. He says, this is all the money I've got. It's $83. I'll pay you that if I can use your copier. And the next thing we see is he's copying
furiously.
And his expression. Mark Ruffalo is becoming a very favourite actor of mine because he's so good at... Because obviously as he's copying it, he's just sort of scan reading them. And it's like, what? And you realise it's powerful. Now, earlier we said we were going to just mention Jack Dunn. When doing the research to this, there were several... I think it was the Boston Herald ran a thing saying... Spotlight movie misses the mark, and it all came out that this Jack Dunn apparently was absolutely horrified he's portrayed in this way,
as a protector.
But he wasn't made to look complicit. He's a very minor part. They said he was watching in a theatre, he was watching the movie and had to go outside and be sick. And then they said the Boston Globe has since accepted or acknowledged their falsification of his character. No, they didn't. What they said was the actual words in this scene were dramatised or fictionalised. That's it. There's no apology. There's just an acknowledgement that the words were fictionalised. So I don't really think Jack Dunn's got that much to complain about. Having said that, if it had been me, maybe I'd be thinking, whoa, hang on, what are you doing? And so he's probably upset.
It does add credence to the fact that in many of the other films that we've examined, they just use a slightly different name, they change the name because the person's still alive, like we said for Catch Me If You Can.
Yeah, but this is just like... I wonder if there's been an element of, do you want to sue us?
I wonder.
Go on then, sue us for defamation of character. Why didn't you do that? Because he hasn't done that. He's complained, but he hasn't done that.
Yeah.
I suspect a judge would say, look, you don't really appear in it. Not many people would remember your name if you hadn't made such a fuss over it. Anyway.
But back to the movie. The documents that Mike's been copying reveal the church knew about the molestation based on letters written to Cardinal Law and how he demanded that the victims' families keep silent. Another letter is from an auxiliary bishop who broke ranks, acknowledging Gagan has a history of homosexual involvement with young boys, trying to find some solution between a mild punishment of
beyond a mild
punishment of weekend work.
Yeah.
Mike wants to write up the story, but Robbie tells him to hold off, that there are 90 other cases out there and they need to get more evidence corroborating them to tell a bigger story. Mike, the Ruffalo character, he's very passionate and he's furious. He's worried that some other people will now steal their story. Mike's adamant that they need to nail these scumbags and they need to print the story to show the church that they can't get away with it anymore.
Mike then visits Sasha at home. He asks her if she's ever thought about going back to church. And she says she has attended with her grandmother, but it's hard with all the things that they now know. Mike says to her that, I grew up a Catholic and I haven't been to church for years, but it's hard to abandon it completely. And I kind of always expected that I'd go back to it one day when I was, older and a bit calmer maybe. He said, but now, reading those letters, my faith's just washed away. It's collapsed. There's nothing left. And you can see he's feeling a sense of loss. Robbie meets up with Peter Connolly in a hotel bar. Peter is one of the PR guys from the guys fronting up for the school that Robbie went to as a boy. Peter complains about Marty and says running the store, Marty Barron, this is the chief editor, says running the story is going to lose you subscribers. Tells Robbie he doesn't want his career to end and forever be known as the guy who ruined the Globe. He says, look, this whole story is just a few bad apples. And Robbie realises, and he says to him, this is how the church operates, isn't it? You have one guy lean on someone else leans on someone else, and the entire town looks the other way. At the Spotlight office the next day, Robbie is told that Sweeney, the judge, ruled in favour of the Globe to unseal the documents. The church has filed an appeal, but the trial court is almost always upheld in matters like this. The document will probably be released in mid-January, around the time that Gagan's trial begins. Ben wants to make their success against the Catholic Church a big story, focusing on a First Amendment victory, but Robbie doesn't want to alert the Herald yet. And it's interesting, Ben Bradley's almost like switch sides now. He's the one driving it forward, and Robbie's going, no. Mike and Robbie now tell Marty and Ben about how some of the documents have already become public due to Garabedian slipping them into the public motion, which is how Mike got hold of them. These documents prove Law knew about the molestations in the 80s. Ben's upset that they hadn't released the story, said, why didn't you publish this? And Robbie says, no. The church covering up molestations has been going on for decades, even before Law. They think they can write up everything in 2 weeks, but suspect it to be a poor move to publish a story during the first Christmas season, just after September the 11th. And he says, no, we need to get them all. We need to make sure that everybody sees, going back to Marty Barron's point, that this is a systemic rot. This is not one individual covering up a few other individuals. So they say, right, we'll run it just after New Year's Day 2002, just before the Gagan trial begins. So Marty now says to the editor, right, bury the Globe's legal victory over the church in the Metro section, which you get the feeling no one really reads.
The Spotlight team decide it's time for action, and Mike begins writing the story. As they do, we hear a soundtrack of children singing Silent Night, Holy Night. The team continues meeting with victims, priests and judges. They're getting quotes from various sources. Robbie visits Jim Sullivan again, this time at his house. Robbie tells Jim that they're running out of time, and he says they've got a cover-up story. They've got cover-up stories about 75 priests, and they need a solid confirmation from Sullivan because he represented them. Jim needs to choose what side he's on, Robbie tells him. Jim tells Robbie, you're out of line, but Robbie responds, the entire city is out of line. Lawyers, politicians, cops. Everyone is looking the other way, but Jim can put an end to it. Jim gets riled up, says that he defended the scumbags, but that was his job. He points out the Globe had a lot of information that they could have alerted them to the story, but they never did any investigating, so they're just as guilty as everybody else. Good point. Jim then kicks Robbie out of his home, but as Robbie is walking towards his car, Jim runs over to him, still angry, but asks him for his list of however many priests, 87 priests. Jim reads over the list and then circles every single name, verifying them as clients that he once represented.
Yeah, that's quite a watershed moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
Through Jack Dunn, Mike is able to make an offer to Cardinal Law to defend himself in the Globe in a full-page, unedited response. But later, he visits Marty and Ben to say, Cardinal Law turned us down. Said the Archdiocese spokeswoman said, we don't even want to know what the questions are. And they're flabbergasted, like, what? And they realise the arrogance of this guy is just incredible. Ben wonders about manning the phones come Sunday morning because they're going to publish on Saturday, given all the attention the story will get and the complaints they expect from the staunchly Catholic Boston public. Certainly it comes across that Boston's the most Catholic city in the States.
And they mentioned somewhere that the last time they did anything like this, they just got swamped with calls of Catholic sympathisers, yeah.
Robbie tells him Matt and Sasha will be there working on a piece, and they'll also have a tip line listed where people can call for more information or with more information.
So there's 2 phone lines now, one to complain that the paper's done a shoddy job, and
one
another
to give them
less high profile one that if anyone wants to confirm or add to their tips, please call Spotlight Direct.
Yeah, and this is where Ben Bradley says we might need extra staff, remembering the protests from the last story about a molesting priest. He's also concerned about picketers and angry letters. Robbie mentions Jim confirming all the priests they suspected as being involved. He's been rattled by Jim's comment, though, that the Globe should have caught it sooner. Ben tells him, look, the story needed spotlight because no single reporter could have broken it. But Robbie's still upset, and it turns out that when Eric McLeish is a Scottish football manager. When Eric McLeish sent his list in, Robbie's worked out that he was one of the reporters in the department that got that information, ran the story, but never thought to investigate further. And Ben Bradley looks at him and he says, that was you, Robbie. You were in charge of that department. He goes, yeah, I just arrived, but yeah, I was. Yeah. So this is my chance to put it right. And he admits it, and you can see how hard it is to do that, but the courage it took to do it. So Marty Barron again just comes in. What a amazing leader. Just calm reassurance. Sorry, go on.
Now, Marty tells them that they need to forgive their past sins because they need to prepare for Law's backlash after the story is published. As hard as they worked over the last 6 months, they're going to have to work even harder going forward. The team leaves for the night, happy with all of their work. Mike stops by Garabedian's office and gives him an early look at the paper. When he leaves, he sees a mother and 2 children in a waiting room of Garabedian's. The mother is fingering rosary beads. It's a callback, an echo to that opening scene at the police station with a mother in a waiting room in the 70s with her kids. Garabedian tells Mike that both boys were abused in recent weeks and encourages Mike to keep doing his work. So it's definitely not an old problem, it's still very fresh happening.
Absolutely. Richard Sipe, the priest turned psychologist who wrote the book, he calls Mike about the story. Mike says to him, how are you able to continue to believe in something after all you know? And Sipe says, look, I still need my faith. The church is an institute of men, and even well-meaning men can fail. Then we see the paper being printed and delivered across the city on doorsteps and in living rooms. The headline on the front page says, Church allowed abuse by priest for years. Matt takes a copy of the paper and drops it on the doorstep of the house where the molesting priests live. On Sunday morning, Matt's looking out of his window. He notes that there aren't any protesters. His colleague suggests, they're probably still at church. This is at the Globe offices. Robbie finds Mike in the parking lot, even though it's their day off. They want to go inside and get a sense of the response to the story. Inside the offices, the main receptionist is bored, saying it's the easiest overtime she's ever made because the phones are all diverted to Spotlight. She mentions she had to send some people down there earlier to help out Matt and Sasha. So Mike and Robbie, they sort of pick up the pace, don't they? They're almost jogging to get down there. Phones are ringing off the hook. After getting off the call, Matt tells them they're getting heaps of responses, almost all positive, and many from victims who have more tips. Matt suggests to Robbie and Mike if they can help out too. The ending titles indicate that in Boston alone, there were nearly 250 priests implicated with over 1,000 survivors involved. Cardinal Law eventually resigned towards the end of 2002, and the cover-ups were revealed to have extended far beyond Massachusetts, leading all the way to Vatican City. Hundreds of cities around the world are then listed as having similar scandals where there was also abuse by priests and subsequent cover-ups by their superiors. And, only a couple of months ago, the Pennsylvania grand jury investigation had been going on for 2 years under Attorney General Josh Shapiro concluded. And we've just got a couple of clips here with Attorney General Josh Shapiro. Yeah, he's a politician, but that doesn't make what he's saying any less true, even if it's delivered in a slightly dramatic way.
A groundbreaking Pennsylvania grand jury report this month revealed the Catholic Church's alleged cover-up of decades of sexual abuse by 301 priests. As we've reported, investigators found disturbing allegations involving more than 1,000 abused children.
In one example, 5 sisters in one family were abused by the same priest. One of the children was just 18 months old. I know that the grand jury also found evidence against more than 400 priests. Why could you only charge 2 of them?
We have weak laws in Pennsylvania which only allowed me to charge 2 priests, in part because our statute of limitations, as it's called, is so short, but because of the sophisticated cover-up, because of the efforts that went by through the bishops, stretching all the way up to the Vatican. They shielded these predator priests from the arm of the law.
99 of the priests were from Pittsburgh. The
Pittsburgh diocese.
Thank you, the Pittsburgh diocese. Its bishop, David Zubik, denies there was a cover-up in a statement saying the Diocese of Pittsburgh today is not the church that is described in the grand jury report. You believe that's true? 2
responses to Bishop Zubik. Number 1, he's not telling the truth. And the church's own documents prove that. And second, child rape in 1970 is the same as child rape in 2018. It is unacceptable. And the idea that the bishop would just simply say, oh, well, this was a long time ago, is demonstrably false. And it is absolutely the wrong response to this.
So, good for Attorney General Josh Shapiro, but sadly, as you heard from the bishop in Pennsylvania, they're saying, oh no, but that was the church back then, it's not like that anymore. Yes, it is. And we're continually finding out that yes, it still is. And I have to, as the Richard Sipe character said, 6%. Doing the research, we discovered, shockingly, scarily, that's pretty much the same reflection in the male population, primarily male population in general society. But people in general society are born, and I'm not excusing that sort of behaviour at all, but You don't choose to come under the laws. You're just born into a country and told these are the laws and you'll obey them or you'll be punished. A priest voluntarily sets himself up as a moral guide and a shepherd to the flock and all this stuff we were talking about, the pastoral care. I mean, for example, if I punch a policeman, I should receive a harsher sentence than if I punch a next door neighbour, because he's a guardian of the law. But by the same token, a policeman who commits a crime should receive a harsher sentence than a member of the general public for the same crime, because he has voluntarily, he or she has set themselves up to be a guardian of the law. And I see it very similarly. So it's the hypocrisy, but it all comes down to this Catholic Church refusal to admit their priests are human beings.
And across the world, in so many different countries, the same pattern of behaviour.
Yes.
Cover up, move the problem, knowing there'll be more victims, and then deny.
Yeah.
And
More
sue
concerned about the image of the Catholic Church. And let's not forget the resources they have. Who's the Australian lady who owns...
Gina Reinhardt, mining magnate.
Gina Reinhardt, there we go, Australian lady. She is the third largest private landowner in the world. She has 17 million hectares of Australian outback, I think,
Yes.
with all the mineral rights.
Yes.
The second biggest private landowners in the world are the Inuit people of North
Canada.
and Eastern Canada, who in the 90s were given 35 million hectares and all the rights, pertaining thereof. So you've got to double her amount to get to the Inuits. The Catholic Church owns 71 million hectares worldwide, and that's not just church land and schools. That is very profitable estates, farms,
cemeteries,
all sorts,
businesses.
Yeah, and they're constantly be given money by people who worry about it. It's easier for a camel to pass the eye of a needle for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And the Catholic Church say, yes, but if you give all your money to us when you die, you're not rich. And off you go. Anyone who knows about the purchase of indulgences in the Middle Ages will understand why Martin Luther felt compelled to nail his thesis to the door of the church in Wittenberg, or wherever it was. Was it Wittenberg?
I think it was,
Yeah. But, it's just so corrupt. It's just so corrupt. Your communion with God can only be through an ordained priest. It's not just the Catholic Church, but I've got to feel that they are the worst example of this.
For sure.
Using something that should be a moral crutch and a moral guide and a moral strength for their own ends.
And just crushing people along the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, maybe we should wrap it up. Do you want to give us some scores?
I can't bring myself to use the word entertainment. I think impact or power, very like Schindler's List, and I think this is probably, as I said in a Facebook post, trailing the fact that we were doing this, next to Schindler's List, this is the other most important and relevant film that we've covered.
Yeah, I
I found it absolutely riveting.
And also entertaining. It was very well edited and acted.
And I've got to pay huge credit, I think, to Mark Ruffalo and to Rachel McAdams. She had the same passion as him. It was just, it manifested in a much...
more controlled way, I guess.
Yeah, calmer,
focused,
understated way. Liev Schreiber, fantastic. Michael Keaton's always great to watch, but Mark Ruffalo's performance, and I'm a huge fan of his now, and I'm also a huge fan of Mike Resendiz, who he studied, and I'm guessing he got that. Like I said earlier, it's not a naive, it's almost an innocent, direct focus and enthusiasm. It's I'm 9, 10, 9.
For which entertainment?
For the impact, for the watchability entertainment
I think
category.
Clear 9.
Easy 9, possibly pushing 10.
9.5. And accuracy, we have to right up there.
Is it a 10? 9 out of 10. I think it's 10 probably.
Let's give our first 10.
And all we've got is this complaint from Jack Dunn, which might or might not be a valid one, but he hasn't sued them for anything, and they've not felt the need to actually apologise and say we misrepresented him, just said some of those words weren't actually said. We've got Sasha, who wrote up the story of the interview of Father Paquin, but wasn't the reporter who actually wrote it up. And apologies
she wrote it up, but she didn't do the interview.
Sorry, she didn't do the interview.
And then there's the Jim Sullivan amalgamation of several lawyers into one.
And that's it.
That's it. I'm happy with the 10.
I think that's 10.
Yeah.
Spotlight, well done.
Well done.
And the director, whose name escapes me, but I'm going to dig it out, Tom McCarthy, had done films before that you would not have thought had led to
Would lead to this?
Yeah, and but really, really impressed. And you get the feeling from the performances you see that, like Mark Ruffalo in that interview, he received the script on the Friday. By Saturday morning, he was on the phone saying, "I'm in.
Yeah,
no, we'll work out contracts and pay and all that rubbish later. Like, I'm in.
Yeah.
I want to do this."
You get the impression that there was a work of passion for a lot of people involved, and it only cost $20 million with some relatively big names attached to it. So it was a work of passion.
And it is such a painful thing for Catholics, especially in somewhere like Boston, where it is just the accepted fact that you're going to be a church-going Catholic. And as one of the reporters in the book I was reading about this whole situation said, law enforcement are just as culpable as the priests, but when you're the cop, you're not going to investigate too rigorously the guy who holds your absolution in his hands. And that's the problem. And
more than the crime, it's the cover-up of the crime.
Yeah,
and
I
more
now
crimes
think,
to be committed.
Pennsylvania doing away, we hope, with their statute of limitations. 3 years for child rape is just absolutely ridiculous. There is no statute of limitations in Britain. You rape a child in 1964 and you're still alive today and they find out. The difficulty is proving it, but if it's proven, you're going down.
Regardless of the crime.
Oh, absolutely.
Or the timing of the crime.
There's some minor ones, I think. Parking offences, I think, have a run-out time, and non-payment of debt might do if it's to a government department. But no, any crime against a person. There is no such thing as a statute of limitations, nor should there be. So next time out, we're going to be doing Elizabeth, starring Cate Blanchett.
Yep.
We've got a real Australian theme going at the moment.
Yeah, we have.
Australian, obviously, Queen Elizabeth wasn't the Queen of Australia.
She
would have been if they discovered it by then.
Australia.
But yes, she's played by Cate Blanchett, who is, of course,
and Geoffrey Rush is in there as well, accomplished Australian actor.
He'll come back in King's Speech, which comes just after Gallipoli.
Yeah,
but that's after Goodfellas, and squeezing it in between all of those, I would just remind you, the movie that led us to actually start this entire idea and podcast series, Braveheart, which is a great film. And William Wallace, in reality, is a great historical character. He did some amazing things. Unfortunately, the two bits don't really join in Mel Gibson's idea of it.
Well, it'll probably be the opposite for accuracy of Spotlight, I guess, is what you're flagging.
Yes.
All right, well, on that note, why don't we wrap it up and say thanks for your time, everybody, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Absolutely. Bye-bye now.
Cheers.